Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
I'd like to thank Melody for coming back. She was here last year, talked about the Sarah Palin book, and she's going to talk about Decision Points by George Bush. It's been on the bestseller list, since November, I think. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it's beaten out Clinton's book. I don't know if it's been on longer. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know if that means anything.
Sure. I'm not sure if it's longer.
So anyway, here's Melody Burns to tell us about Decision Points by George Bush.
I read the book, not just because I'm a Republican and everybody knows that, but when I ran for office a few years ago, 2006 or 2007, I lost my election because of George Bush. And so I felt I needed to read his book. And I say that because when I was running and knocking on doors and talking to people, and you'd knock on your door and I'd tell them who I was, and then I'd say, well, I'm a Republican, and first thing they said to me was, I hate George Bush, and they'd slam their door and that would be the end of it. So I blamed it on him, and it worked for a while. So I thought when the book came out, I should read it. So I sent a note to the publishing company way before it came out, and I said, first of all, I'd like to read the book, but I'd also like to interview him on the radio. And they sent me back a note and said, first of all, who are you, and where is Albany, New York? So I had to explain that to them, and I had to send them other interviews that I've done so they know that I'm for real, I'm not just pulling their leg. So then they sent me the book, and I had an early copy of the book. Before it was actually published. And it was funny because people would come to my house and I'd have the book there, and the book kept moving closer to the door. Everybody was trying to steal the book because they wanted to read it. And eventually I finished it and I did pass it on, and then Joe sent me another copy so I could just go back through my notes. Hi, welcome, come on in, sit down, relax. And it is, I think the book gives you a very different viewpoint of a president of the United States. And I say that because the book actually made him to be a human being. And I think that sometimes when we look at presidents or people up at that stature, we don't look at them as the same level as you and I. We think of them as not really people that cry and people that have a lot to do with their family, but somebody who's always on. Their hair's never a mess. Everything's always perfect. But when you read through this book and you read about George Bush and you read some of the things that he talks about, you quickly discover that he is very much like you and I. So I was thrilled with that. I mean, I kind of thought he was, but I wasn't really sure. It's like he starts the book, he talks about how he grew up and some of the decisions he made, and he talks about Laura and how he fell in love with her and they got married, and he goes through his dad and all that. And I said, I don't care. I don't care about what happened when he was younger. But it's a good section of the book. It is the beginning of the book, so by all means you should read through that, and it'll give you some insight into all of that stuff. Now, something I want to talk to you about, something that I discovered very quickly in this book was. When he goes through the first part of the book, he kind of summarizes the whole book. So if you read through the first 100 pages, you pretty much have a good idea what's in the book. But in part of the book, he talks about, right in the beginning, he talks about the debate. Do you remember the debate in 1999, the presidential debate? And Tom Brokaw is one of the moderators. And there's another moderator there with him. And one of the questions they asked him was, out of everybody out there, where does your philosophy come from, and who do you look at as the person that had the most effect in your life? And of course he answers Christ. All right? And so at the time he doesn't think anything of that. But then his father and his mother call him because they're calling him on the way home, and his dad says to him, well, you did very nice, and that was a nice answer. And so he thought, well, which one? Because he thought he did very well. And his father said, the Jesus answer. And he never thought anything about it until the next day in the newspaper, when all of a sudden in the newspaper it was a big deal how, why is he bringing Christ into this? And, the guy running for president needs to think about the Lord before he makes his decision. But throughout the whole book, he pretty much explains to you and talks in the decisions that he makes, he goes back to his faith quite often. And I think that, looking at all the previous presidents and talking about them, we didn't really get that much from the other ones. There wasn't that much of a God sense in everything they were doing. But through his presidency, you pretty much, they slammed him with that all the time. And it was something that they told us that, somebody would bring it up and say every decision he was making was based on that, on his faith and pretty much on God. So that kind of goes through the whole book. He talks about that whole thing. A big part of that chapter also is the Al Gore. Remember in 2000 when he ran and the hanging chads thing? Well, he talks all about that and goes into great depth into thinking that he won. Because what happened is first he's told that he's won, and Gore calls him and kind of congratulates him. And then a little bit later he finds out that no, that's not really what happened. And Gore pulls it back and said he's going to fight to the end. And so he describes all of that process and how he feels through that, and who's coming in and out through telling him what's going on, and then what actually happens when he wins. So if you recall all that, and it was quite a mess for a long time. So you get a little bit of insight into, what happens as a candidate at that level when everybody's telling you one thing, in reality it's completely something else. And then, when your opponent first comes in and says, okay, congratulations, and then he turns around and says, okay, no way at all, I'm fighting this to the end. Yeah, so it's kind of a goofy section, but it really brings you into the political arena, and it makes you say, I never want to be involved in that again. Because of that. I mean, some of us think it's a crazy world, but it's a real crazy world. So you get some of that insight. He does a whole chapter on personnel, which at first I thought, well, why is he doing that? And then as you read through the book, his staff become his best friends. If they're not best friends before, they're pretty much his best friends through the course of his whole campaign and the election process, and then as he's president. And he calls them all by their first name, and you notice that through the book. Like Dick Cheney, Condoleezza Rice's Condi, Tommy Franks, Tommy. So you see that quite often. It's a whole different, thing. I guess I expected it to be much more formal. But it was very, very personal. Like they're all best friends. And even when they come to Camp David at different occasions, same thing. And all the way through the book, you'll have to remember who Ben is and who Tommy is, as you go through, and Hank and all of those people, because he talks about that. So I think that's what makes me feel that this is such a human person, because of that, because everybody's his best friend, and he's always asking people what's going on. He does a lot in this book. He talks about all of the meetings and sitting in a Situation Room, and he describes the White House, and he describes Camp David. So you get to listen to all that, which seems to me is like a big mysterious place. Everybody goes to Camp David, but we're never really exposed to it. Has anybody ever seen a picture of Camp David? I don't think they ever show you anything there, right?
If they do, they have to kill you.
Yeah. But I thought about it when I was reading the book, and all the meetings and stuff, and I thought, well, because he describes it, and I said, I don't recall ever seeing any photographs of them, maybe like walking, on a path or driving up a road maybe. But I don't ever recall seeing anything. And he talks about the buildings there. And his sister, I want to say Dory, I think, was actually married, the first person to have any service in the chapel that's at Camp David. So you learn that. And I didn't know that. So yeah, go ahead.
I did see, because he did an interview with Hannity one time, and I think they did a walkthrough part of it.
Did they?
Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't recall seeing anything, but, to me it was like...
It may have been his home in Texas, maybe not that.
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to keep track of all the buildings. Where are they and where they're going all the time.
There was a few pictures when Carter signed they had that piece of...
The peace accord, yeah. Oh, yeah, I think so. Yeah, I remember that. So, all right, so let's see, where else are we going? Everybody knows about the Dick Cheney piece. Remember when he was running for election in 2004? And everybody hated Dick Cheney. I think people hated him because, to me, he seemed like the brains of the outfit. But maybe that was just my impression. I don't know. Did you feel that way? Did you think that Dick Cheney was the brains? And you did, yeah. And
it gave me the feeling that he was telling Bush what to do.
Yeah, I think that's what happened to so many of us. We believe that. But when you read through that, you understand differently. He relied on Dick because Dick really knew what he was doing. but he wasn't. And then Cheney was smart enough to realize that there was a problem with him in the presidency. And so he comes to him, and he actually tells him, Cheney does, that he should look for someone else because of that he thought he was going to be a detriment to that. And Bush actually considers it and ponders it. And as with Donald Rumsfeld, they couldn't figure out who to replace him because, he was going to get rid of Rumsfeld also. But how do you replace these guys? And he couldn't figure that out. So he said, you know what? You're in, and if you'll stay, then I'll keep you. So he tells you all about the whole Dick Cheney thing and how that works. I like Dick Cheney. He's a strong character. All through the book, he talks about him. He at one point they had I want to say a tip, and that was over Scooter Libby, wanting the pardon. And Cheney, of course, thought that Bush should do that, and Bush said, wouldn't do that. And Cheney made the remark that, it's like leaving somebody on the battlefield. And so he was pretty upset. And so Bush felt that Cheney would never speak to him again, but then they saw each other at another event, and they did. But there was that little tiny tip in there, so you saw a little bit of that. Probably the point, and this is what Bush determines as the point when all of that, the attacks, the personal attacks and the media attacks, when they happened, is during the stem cell research segment. And he said that whole discussion, and he really goes into that in great length, and he explains about it and how he had such difficulty making that decision, because here he is, a man of faith on one side, but yet he's got this whole other conflict going on stem cell research. And how does he weigh that so he can go along with that, and clearly understanding that it is great, it's good research, it will save lives, but yet there's that other piece of it. And I don't want to ruin too much of this for you because I want you to read the book. But he kind of weighs all of that, and he talks to people. And what I discovered through the book, he talked to everybody. And not only would he talk to them, but he would pick their brain a lot. And I guess I looked at the president as kind of the person who would sit back and say, well, I know this to be true, and I'm going to call this person in my office and see what they have to say, but I'm just going to do what I want to do. Now, I got the impression from him that he pulled a lot of groups together, even reached outside the White House and went to people that he knew in Texas and other places across the country, and went from people that he knew to people they knew and down these long lines to ask advice and to ask questions and gather his information. So that was kind of surprising to me that he would go that far down and do that. Of course, he does end up doing the stem cell research, and he does sign that in. And immediately after that happens, he gets attacked, and that's when all of that bad, he's stupid, he's this, he's that, and then it goes from there and it just moves on. And he said that was probably the most difficult part of dealing with that because of the effect that it had on his wife and his daughters. Because he's so close to his two daughters, and they tried to completely stay out of the whole political arena for the longest time. And then just prior to the 2004 election, both of them said, we can't take this anymore, Dad. We can't take the abuse that you're getting, and we'd hate to see you lose, so we want to get involved. And finally he said, okay, you can be involved. So it kind of brings them into the whole mix. So, yeah, I often wonder how they deal with, even with President Obama, we don't hear a lot about their children, which is okay, and I don't think we should. I don't think it's any of our business. But I often wondered, how do the children deal with all the negativity that comes around with that position? And when I've read all the president's books that I can get my hand on all through, and other elected officials, and I wonder, first of all, why the hell would you want to be president? Because, it's constant abuse, and no matter what you do, you're doing something wrong in somebody's mind. And people take the liberty to constantly attack you. I'm guilty of it. I do it. I'm not going to deny that. And so you see that, and I think, well, why do you want this position? And through the course of the book, he kind of tells you why this meant so much to him. Not only because his dad had been there and watching his dad, and as he celebrates some of the things, the accomplishments that he has, he goes back to some of the accomplishments that his dad has. And so you see quite a bit of that. He compares it to, and what they mean and the difference that it made in the country. So Yeah, and when I spoke to his publicist about this, and this was last year, and at the time somebody was talking about his brother Jeb Bush getting involved in the race, which I thought was a mistake, and I still do. And she was saying that someone had asked him that question, and he kind of avoids the answer. He's like, well, that would be nice to follow in the footsteps, but it's probably not the right thing, and I don't think a Bush could get elected. I don't think a Bush could get elected. I mean, I think it's just the name. At this point, I really don't think it could happen. But maybe I'm off the mark on the whole thing. Yeah. A big part of this book, and probably what I think he will be known for, is 9/11. So if you don't read anything else in the book, you may want to just read that chapter. And he talks about it being a beautiful Tuesday morning. It's a fabulous day. Laura's at home. He's gone to Florida. He's down at the school. When they get the first notice, which was actually before we see him on TV. Remember, he's in the classroom with the kids. Well, he already knows about the first one because they told him it before he goes into the classroom. So he's sitting in there with the kids, and then Andy Card comes in and whispers in his ear, and tells him that another plane had hit the World Trade Center. And then they realize that it's really something going on. And we saw from the eyes of the media, like he was just sitting there not willing to do anything. But yet, when you read what he's telling you, he's sitting back trying to gather information. He didn't feel that it was right to get up in front of those kids and all the parents that were in the room, and all of a sudden get up and cause a big stir because they didn't have enough information at that time. So he talks about the feeling with that and how, here he was in Florida. This is happening in New York. Then he hears that it happens at the Pentagon. Then they hear, what's going on with Flight 93, and he's way away from everything, and nobody wants him to come back to Washington. And so he describes that whole little fight about how do I get from Air Force One, which is flying around, and where they're taking us to Louisiana, when I should be in the White House because the American people are going to be looking for me, and as a president, I have the role to be there. And so he goes through that little argument about how does he get them to let him to come back to the White House, where Dick Cheney is, where Laura is, how does he reach people? Because you remember, communication was a major problem. So he talked all about the communication issues and even the communication issues within the White House. I mean, there were times when he was on the plane where he couldn't get the information that he needed. Nobody could talk to anybody. Nobody really knew what was going on. And I think that we kind of got that impression, maybe not right around that date, but like later on. We as the American public, every now and then you heard that there were communication issues. But he really goes into that so you understand the depth of those problems and what was happening. He talks about the decision to go back to the White House and then going back to the White House and that night sleeping in bed and they have a bomb scare, which we don't know. So they've got to go downstairs, I guess the bunker, wherever it is. So they have to do that. And we as the American public weren't quite aware of some of the things that were going on at the White House. And I think the feeling that they had, that it wasn't over, that there was more coming and that they didn't have enough intelligence, but they had enough. You know how sometimes if you know too much, or whatever it is. Sometimes knowing too much is worse than not knowing enough, and I think that's, however that works. But that's what I think was part of that, and that's what they did with that. And so he spends quite a bit of time talking about that whole thing. He talks about going to New York City and, landing and looking out the plane window and actually seeing the piles and the smoke and what was going on, and the impression that left on him and through the rest of his whole presidency. And there was a woman there, he went to Ground Zero, and then they went over to the Javits Center where the family members of like the Port Authority and the police were and fire. And he goes over there and he meets a woman who is looking for her son. And the woman gives him a medallion that belonged to her son. And so you find out that he held on to that medallion right up to his last day. I mean, he still has it, but every morning he had that with him in the White House. So that, right there gave me another, okay, he is a human being. It was like over and over again, that kept hitting hard to me. So you may recall that 9/11 pretty much stepped us into the war. And he explains all about the intelligence, or as I like to say sometimes, the lack of intelligence, not really knowing what's going on. He talks about why they thought they had WMDs, and then they found out that they really didn't. And, but they were going with the fact of what they've been told and all the information. And so through that chapter, he goes through all the meetings that they had where they pretty much were of that understanding that it was there and that this was a problem, and that Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden and everybody over there was hell-bent to get us. And so he had to make the decision. And he also talks about, as making that decision, how who voted for and who voted against, which, as you know, comes back later to actually help him win the next election. Because if you recall, in the 2004 election, I think he was still riding pretty high, and the whole hate thing wasn't as bad yet. And a lot of people were still feeling the strength of 9/11 and what happened there. And during a debate, a discussion with John Kerry, who was really hitting him hard about 9/11 and then the war and what happened, and we shouldn't have gone over there, and all our servicemen and women were killed, and it was a big mistake, and there were no WMDs, and blah, 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 blah. And then what happens is, like, after that, the next day, Kerry is at a discussion, and someone asked him that question, well, how did you vote on that, on going to war? And of course, Kerry voted for it. So he has to come clean on that. And so he looks at that as a point as this, that kind of helped him in that election. And he talks through that whole, what happens and what generals he goes to, and, between Tommy Franks and Petraeus and everybody on the ground, and, the information that they gathered. But what I liked about that part is, if you're not a military person, you don't want all that jargon, and you don't want all that this and that. So when he writes the book is written like you and I would be talking. So you don't have all that technical garbage and all that blah, blah, blah stuff. He's right on our level, so you can read it, you understand their conversations. He explains some of the decisions that they made, like some of his advisors, why they backed him up and what they said. So it makes that a little bit easier to understand that, why we went into Iraq and Afghanistan. It's funny, reading through his notes about Afghanistan, I read another book not too long ago about the special forces that went into Afghanistan, which was part of this whole thing. So I already had the background of that and of the forces that went in, and what happened to the men. 11 of those men were all wounded. And so then when you read it through in the book, I had their point of reference and then I had his, so it worked out really, really good to tie them together. And it kind of made me realize that what the decision they made, and then when they sent that force in, what actually happened, and then they kind of followed through in here, which you don't get in that other book. So it worked out really good for me. And I can share the name of those books with you if you'd like to read them. But it was interesting to see what he thought through this whole book, what his most meaningful accomplishment was. Does anybody have any idea what that was? Through his whole 8 years? You want to take a gander, just guess what it is?
What he thought it was?
Yeah, what do you think his most meaningful accomplishment was?
Maybe saving the country from further terrorist attacks?
Yeah, no, you know what, it's actually that. And what he says is it was 9/11, because for 7.5 years after 9/11, there was not a terrorist attack on American soil. So, but you don't get that till almost like the end of the book when he goes through and tells you all that. And yeah, and I would think that it would have been something else. I wasn't quite sure, reading through, because he goes so much into depth on some of the other things that went on. And I was surprised, but I guess when you think about it, if you were to ask like a younger person about George Bush, and I've done this just out of curiosity, and say to them, well, what do you think about George Bush? Because I have like 48 nieces and nephews, right? So I'll say to them, what do you think about George Bush? Well, first of all, he was terrible, in their mind, because he killed America and, made us do everything bad and, did all kinds of things. But I'm like, well, what did he do? And when you ask them, well, do you know what happened on 9/11? Well, yeah, somebody flew some planes, that always irritates me, but somebody flew some planes into the World Trade Center. And I said, well, do you know what happened after that? And they don't. And so when I think about it, and I try to explain to them that, for a period in time, America became strong again for those few, and we still are strong. But there was a sense of everybody together as one unit. And then I think that's because of George Bush. I think, when he went to New York and you saw him on that pile, and that was very, very, very spontaneous. And he explains that to you and how they had to grab a megaphone, and, and this older gentleman, Bob, was there with the hard hat on. And when he gets up there and talks, and at first they can't hear him, and then he pretty much repeats whatever they say. And I think that feeling right there really, I think, defines his whole presidency right there. But then as you're reading through the book and you go through everything else, and of course you remember when he's on the aircraft carrier? And so he talks about getting on the aircraft carrier. And they hung that banner that, that said mission accomplished. And he didn't even know it was up there. They hung it behind him. And so he's up talking to everybody on the aircraft carrier, and happens to look behind him, and he sees the banner, and doesn't think anything of it because, they're talking about a specific piece of that. And then, of course, he gets crucified for saying that, and he still is. You still hear that every now and then. Remember George Bush and his mission accomplished deal, so we still hear that. He goes over Iraq and talks about the whole, sending more troops over there, because that, of course, is a big issue. Where some people kept saying, we got to pull out. And he argues for more troops, thinking that, there has to be a way we have to give them freedom. And he was pretty much driven for freedom for them. So he explains, why they were over there, why he felt they needed more troops. Some of the generals came in and pretty much were thinking, no, you don't. Let's just get out of there. A lot of people wanted to get out of there. He talks about the waterboarding, which, I don't know about you, but when they first started talking about waterboarding, I had the impression in the beginning a few years ago that they were doing it to anybody and everybody. If they captured you, they were going to waterboard you. And it only ended up being three individuals, and they gathered a lot of information from that. And the first one that they did it to, of course, when they did the waterboarding, they did it because the guy would not give them any information unless they did something like that. And it had to do with Islamic law, like you had to push them to a certain point before they would actually give you, once you did something like that, like waterboarding, then it was okay to give you the information. And so he explains all of that in here, and it kind of opens your eyes into, okay, well, I guess I can understand that, why they did that. But then you find out they only did it to 3. Probably the most embarrassing point of his presidency was Abu Ghraib. I think that from reading the book, and he talks about that. How he didn't realize what was going on there until he saw the photos himself, and how upset he was with that, and how, that was the point where I think Donald Rumsfeld fell from grace considerably. And it was like, well, how do I replace him? And then they figured out they didn't have anybody right away to replace him. So he talks about that, changing all of that, and what do they do? The Patriot Act is in here. He talks about that. Of course, as you know, it's come back. And he talks about, how does he do that without taking away American freedoms and, making people feel like the government is too busy in their business. And so there's a lot of discussion. And even though it seemed like he wanted it, and it was something that he was hell-bent to do, when you read through his decisions and his talking points with other people, it was not something he was crazy about doing, but he realized that there was a mean to the ends, that, to save Americans and to get more information. Yeah, go ahead.
Melody, I thought Rumsfeld, one of the reasons he went is because of the stagnation that was going on in Iraq, too. He seemed to be comfortable with the way things were going. Mm-hmm. And I don't think he didn't think the surge was necessary.
Well, I think that's what I said. Maybe that's what I meant to say. But yeah, he wasn't really. Bush wanted more. Rumsfeld was sitting back and saying, let's do what we can do and leave it like it is. Yeah. And there were a lot of other problems in the White House with people. There were not quite whistleblowers, but there were a lot of like backstabbers. I'm going to call them backstabbers. And he talks about that, where they have some of these meetings, and then people would take that information and pass it on to someone who shouldn't have it, whether it's the press or somebody else. And so there were a lot of points where they may have had like little fights here and there, whether it was with Rumsfeld or with Cheney or with other members. And somebody would hear it, and then somebody would run to the press right away. So there was always that, well, there's so much strife in the White House, there's problems, they don't even get along, and there's a lot of that.
But I heard something when Rumsfeld, they asked him a question one time, and he says you have to fight with the army that you have.
Mm-hmm.
That's earlier on when a lot of our troops were getting killed with the IEDs because
yeah, very
the armies
early.
weren't armored
Right.
and stuff like that. It just seems like Rumsfeld was very unconcerned. He gave the attitude, I sort of interpreted
so?
that he gave the attitude that he was unconcerned about what was going on.
Mm-hmm. I read his book, Rumsfeld's book also. No.
Like that.
No, but you know what? I don't know if that was, I don't know, because to me, I think that was just his nature. The way I look at Donald Rumsfeld was he's pretty much a guy where he makes a decision and he's hell-bent to stay with that decision. And it seemed like, in reading his book, it seemed like it's very difficult to get him to sway one way or the other. And so because he was so involved in the whole discussions, the early discussions about going to Iraq and Afghanistan and going into war, I think that his problem was, okay, we made this decision early on. We all discussed it. I'm a firm believer that this is what we should do, and we need to stick to it. And I think that it was more that, whether it's a stubborn streak or not, but I think he felt that, we laid this plan out, we should accomplish it with what we have. Whereas, some of the other members, including Bush, was saying, we can't accomplish it that way. It's not as easy as we thought. I think that was part of that.
I had the impression that he was unprepared for the aftermath of the invasion to a certain extent.
Bush or Rumsfeld?
Rumsfeld.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I don't think they had a clue, that it was going to be like that. I think they thought that they could get in and get out. And look at them now, we're still in Afghanistan, 9-10 years later. I think that was a problem of this presidency, that, thinking that it's, the war on terror is going to be a short war. And
it seems to me they didn't have a contingency plan
Yeah.
if something did go wrong like it did after the invasion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess you could get that from the book also, because that's why they went back and said, hey, hold on just a second, we need more troops. We need to reevaluate this whole thing. So yeah. I think what happened was the war in Iraq and Afghanistan is such a different animal. I mean, first of all, look at the land, look at the geography, very different. And they talked about, well, we have friends in the Northern Alliance. So you have a small section of people, but you don't have anybody else. But then how do you really know if those people are with you or not? And looking at what's going on in Afghanistan now, I think that we're in the same boat. Who's a friend and who's not a friend? And then one day they're a friend, and the next day somebody comes in and gives them $5 or a goat, and yeah, and I think that was part of the issue. And I think when they went into this originally, that wasn't part of the whole. It wasn't part of the groundwork that they laid. I don't think they quite understood where they were going and what they were going to do. But that's, everybody has their own opinion, but that's where I felt.
It's just when you take a dictator out,
Yeah.
there's a vacuum, and they didn't think there was going to be a vacuum for some reason.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you're seeing this now with, for example, Egypt. I think that there's such uncertainty because, yeah, well, yeah. I don't know why they haven't taken him out yet. I don't understand that, but yeah. But I think that's a little bit of it that you're going to see in the book, where you're going to see some of those discussions where not everybody agrees, and he makes the decision based on like the majority of the people telling him what to do, and he relied on his military people a lot. It was funny to look at throughout each chapter, you discover somebody that, I don't know if they're, I'm going to call them backstabbers like I did earlier, but, you find people within the staff where I can always do it better than the other guy. And so he realizes, who some of those people are, sometimes a little too late, but, he does talk about those. Like I said, he spent a lot of time working on his staff, and he spends a whole chapter on personnel where he describes the people that he looks at and why he selected them and what he felt their qualifications were and what they could bring to it. But then as he goes through, and it's 8 years, remember, that's a long time, he finds that some people just weren't made for that level. And you may trust him today, but it doesn't mean you're going to trust him tomorrow. So I thought that was good. He talks about Ted Kennedy in here, and he liked him. He said the first movie that they viewed at the White House in the theater was the Kennedy story. And Laura and him had invited the Kennedy family, Ted and his wife, and some of the relatives to come over and view that with him. And the whole purpose was he needed to talk to Ted about a few things and, to get some things passed. And so he brings him over and they have dinner, and the next day Ted sends him a note, and they kind of liked each other. And he found him to be easy to work with. And most people would think, well, my God, Republicans and Democrats aren't working together. But, Bush through the book, he tends to believe that it is important to do that. There are times when you have to, put your coat of arms aside and actually do what you can to accomplish things. It doesn't always work out for the good, but, he does talk about doing that through there.
Kennedy was an open liberal.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
very much so.
I mean, I don't agree with what he did, but at least he was.
You knew where he
what
stood.
was doing.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and I think that's the truth. The truth with Ted, you always knew where he was going to be. He pretty much stayed tried and true to what he was. He was a liberal, and he was proud of that, and he believed in that philosophy. So at least you knew how to deal with him because of that. It wasn't like a guessing game, which it is with so many other people you don't really know. And I think that was part of the reason why Bush liked him. Was part of that deal. He also talks about, when he's running for office, the whole thing prior to 2004, and it was his hope that Howard Dean would be the person that he'd run against, and he tells you why, because he says he thought Howard was kind of scattered and kind of out there on the edge and could easily be tipped over the edge. But then of course John Kerry wins that, and so then he has to run against John Kerry, and he has some mixed emotions for John Kerry in there. Not that he was a bad guy, but he does have some mixed emotions about them, and he describes those, which I thought was a little difficult to take at times, but it was okay. It was all right. You'll like that section. The day of fire, of course, is 9/11. There are photos in the middle of the book. I don't know if you've seen some of them, but there are, and I'll pass the book around so you can look at them. There's photos of him and his dad, younger, some of the things that he did younger, him and his wife, the girls, Camp David, Tony Blair, some of the people that he actually got to spend some time with. So I'll pass it around in a minute. Oh, yeah. You like my tags? I do this to all my books. Yeah. Is it? Post-it notes, world's greatest invention. I love it, yeah. Another part of the book that I wanted to get to before we run out of time, the 04 election, which was actually another one of those events. I mean, he had Florida, and he had some of the other major states, but he wasn't sure about Ohio, because remember, at that time in 04, Ohio it looked like it was going for John Kerry. And so he wasn't really sure. He went to bed that night not knowing, and nobody wanted to call the race, and Kerry hadn't called him, and he didn't really want to know, and no one wanted him to go out early and say, okay, I won, I'm glad we're on the course and all that stuff. And so what happens in the next morning is Tony Blair calls him, Tony as he calls him, calls him up and says, I didn't stay up late, but I did find out that not only did you win, but you got more votes than any other president in history. So it was actually Tony Blair that told him that he won the 2004 election. So yeah, and then I guess he was still riding high from the whole 9/11, I think, at that time. And then as he goes through, and he talks about 2005 being the end of the end, that he lost all his mojo as far as being president in 2005. That, between all the attacks and everything else, it was going downhill from there. And he realized that. He realized that, as a president, he no longer had the respect and the power and the command from that point on. And that's almost, in a way, it's kind of sad, but it's like, well, when you read through what was going on and you think about where the country was and where we were headed, you could understand that. Remember, Iraq was going on, Afghanistan. We were starting to realize we had no money, that the country was in trouble financially. So you're getting all of that, and he talks about that. He goes through Social Security. He, talks about his decisions on that. He talks about immigration and the point of, him pushing one direction in immigration with the Republican Party pushing the other direction, which pretty much made him lose a lot of face from his base of supporters because of the way he felt on immigration. So he looks at that. Katrina is another huge section of the book. He talks about Katrina. And Katrina was an interesting thing because he talks, you get the first 2 pages of the chapter, and he kind of sums up what happens. But then as you read through the rest of the chapter, he leads you through, they know the storm is coming. He's talked to the governor. He's talked to the mayor. Everybody tells them they're okay. They don't need the feds. And they're well prepared. But then when he gets down there, he finds out that, this was, of course, after the fact, they were not at all well prepared. They kind of let things slide. The government of Louisiana and Mississippi was better, but Louisiana was a mess. And they let things falter. But yet he was taking the blame for it. And, you see that piece where he's talking about Mike Brown. Do you remember when he was talking about FEMA, Mike Brown? And so he talks about that. What had happened was he was talking to somebody else about him. I think it was Mississippi, Governor of Mississippi was saying what a great job that Mike Brown had done for them, and he did all this work. So, he's a real good guy, and we should honor him and thank him. So then George, of course, when he gets down there to New Orleans, he actually says what the governor of Mississippi said, which was, Mike Brown's doing a great job, which everybody down there said, how can you say that? Look at what's going on down here. FEMA had failed terribly. And then after he says it, and not even within that afternoon, the press is on him big time and hounding him this shows you how out of touch George Bush is. He doesn't really know what's going on, saying that they were handling things, but yet, here we have these people who have no water, have no food, they're on the roofs of buildings, and, you have people living on the roadway. And so that whole thing just goes completely out of control. And, he talks about all of that problems and how he felt that Katrina was devastating. It was a terrible time for us, but it could have been avoided. If everybody would have worked together, and if they would have been a little more honest about what was happening with that, then we wouldn't be in the situation that it's in. Let me read you something that's toward the end of the book that was kind of interesting, because when you think about this whole thing, when you think about being president, and what happens pretty much for 8 years, or even longer than that, because the whole time you're running, and now they run continually. He's talking about you have no privacy, you can't go anywhere, your life belongs to everybody but you. And so this was after he leaves the White House, when President Obama comes in, and he only does like a page or 2 about that, how they get up in the morning and he walks to the Oval Room. He goes into the Oval Office for the last time, and how quiet it is and nobody's there. And then he goes into another room and all the staff is there, and he talks to them and says goodbye. And then he goes downtown with the Obamas. They go through the whole inauguration, and then he leaves. And so he talks about getting back home and getting to their home in Dallas. So this is what he says about that. He says, this is when they've moved into their house in Dallas, and he says, shortly after we moved to Dallas, I took Barney. You remember Barney, the dog, the little black Scottish Terrier? I took Barney for an early walk around our neighborhood. I hadn't done anything like that in more than a decade. Barney never had. He had spent his entire life at the White House, Camp David, or Crawford. Barney spotted our neighbor's lawn, where he promptly took care of his business. There I was, the former president of the United States, with a plastic bag in my hand, picking up that which I had been dodging for the last 8 years. So I thought that was a great way to end the book. It was kind of an interesting way. So yeah, it's worth the read, I think, just to get the point of view of a president. And I think you should read all of the books from all the presidents. First of all, to figure out how did we get where we are. I didn't agree with everything George Bush did. I firmly believe he was a big spender. Got a little carried away with that, and he talks about that in here, and he talks about Freddie and Franny, and then he talks about also the bailouts in here, and how it was John McCain who actually called the meeting to discuss it, the bank bailouts, when he should have been out on the campaign trail. And so that's in there. But I think it's important because it is a piece of history, but it also kind of gives you an insight into somebody who's running our country and making those decisions and how they make those decisions. And I think some of us, for years, believe that the person that's in charge just kind of makes a decision and tells everybody else what we're going to do. But by reading through this book, you get a little more insight into how many people are actually involved in the decision. Granted, the person at the top of the ladder, like in this case, George Bush, had to suffer for the decisions that he made, and he did take responsibility for those. So I think that was a good thing. But well worth the read. I recommend it just for that. Yeah.
Yes, you said that Bush was informed by his faith when he said he was a Christian, a born-again Christian, and so on, and a lot of his decisions were made because of his faith. Another president just before him was a man by the name of Jimmy Carter. Now, Carter certainly was a born-again Christian. He still is a lay preacher, and everything he did was informed by his faith. And the expectation, if you're a Southern Baptist fundamentalist born-again Christian, you would maybe tend more to the right. Now, how do you explain? They both have the same religious philosophy, whereas Carter was more or less a liberal, and you certainly would then call Bush a conservative. But coming out of the same born-again religion.
Like the Bible Belt area.
So it seems odd to me that one would be, on thinking on religious issues, so diverse. Now, what's the explanation? I guess you could believe anything.
Yeah, you know what? That's a good point, because when you think about it, they're both Bible Belt, Bible thumpers, I guess we could call them.
Carter was a military man.
I'm sorry?
Carter was in the military.
Yeah, which really boggles your mind when you think about some of his decisions and some of the things that he did. You know what? And I looked at that. I looked at Clinton, who knows what his is, but when you throw them all together and you look at that, and you look at, basic philosophy and ideology, and, sometimes it's different things that actually rule our destiny, I guess. Whereas I think that, Bush being very tight to his parents, very tight to his wife, very much involved with his faith, and he lived it every day. He talked about reading the Bible and praying every day, and kind of looking for it. Whereas I think maybe Carter didn't think he needed it, as a guiding tool, and that maybe he could look at his philosophy, his political philosophy over that instead. I think that may be the only way to explain that. I guess I look at them as two different people. I never really looked at Carter as being as religious as George Bush, even though he was, and even more so in some respects, but I just didn't look at it that way. And I think that is the left and right. For example, the abortion issue and some of those other things, I think was a big thing for me. Yeah, go ahead.
I enjoyed your talk.
Oh, thank you.
I read most of the book.
Did you like it?
I actually liked the book because it's not a traditional presidential memoir.
Right.
Going year to year. It's a good read.
Yes, it is.
Now, having said that, I want to make a few comments and hopefully creating some reaction. I'm a trained political scientist.
Okay.
I was negative to George Bush throughout his entire 2 terms. I remain negative. But history would judge. I won't be around.
Right.
But it takes decades to really make a judgment on the president. Right now, he's rated fairly well.
Yeah.
On the 3 major chapters, on 9/11, it's still amazing that he sat in that classroom and the Secret Service did not pick him up and carry him out.
You mean for security reasons?
For security reasons.
Yeah.
Let me continue and respond. But in that chapter, he says that we didn't have prior intelligence or information that Osama and his criminals may be hijacking planes within the U.S. We know that's not true. What we seem to know is that information actually reached Condi's desk prior to 9/11, and somehow nothing really took place. Does not.
Yeah.
But more importantly, let me just continue.
Yeah. Okay. I did not make points now.
As a result of 9/11, he called it a worldwide war on terror, as opposed to a more limited police action dealing with criminals. By using the legal term worldwide war on terror, it made him a wartime president, which the neocons, which he was surrounded by, like barnacles attached to a ship. All the neocons wanted a much more powerful president, including Cheney. And by using the legal rubric of the worldwide war on terror, he became a much more powerful president. My conclusion is that George Bush should have looked and reread Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address, and that Halliburton took over the White House.
Do you think so? Yeah.
All right, I'll stop.
Well, let me start back at the beginning. When you're talking about in the classroom and the security, I think that the area was secure, so I don't think they needed to pull him out of the classroom. Do you know what I mean? I think that there were enough, and it sounded like there were enough people there with him that they probably felt he was secure there. Not only that, they knew right where he was, which made it easier than having him at a different location. And it wasn't like it was that long before they pulled him into the other room. I think he says in the book 7 minutes or something, yeah. Amount of information. As we know, reading the 9/11 Commission report, I think what had happened, I think that, and I agree with you, that I think that someone, probably more than someone, probably quite a few people knew that this was a possibility. Because in the book, he leads up to, what's going on with terror. They're well aware of Al-Qaeda and, some of these other things going on, but nobody quite makes the connection that they could do it here in our own land. And I think what had happened was we had so much information that nobody was connecting the dots. They all had a bunch of dots, and nobody took the time to sit down and connect those dots. So I firmly believe that we should have known about it, and that somebody somewhere did, whether it was Condoleezza Rice or somebody else, but I think the information was out there. They just weren't putting it together. And I also think that part of that was, I think that America had, and we still do have the feeling that, here we are, we're at the top of the world, nobody can touch us. And I think that was a big problem there. They didn't believe that some nut job, over on the other side of the world could wreak such havoc on us. So I think that was an issue with them. And, this was like a slap of reality all of a sudden, something that they didn't take as serious as everybody else did. And they were aware that these people existed, and then all of a sudden this is what happened. 9/11, the jets. If I recall reading Rum's book, and National Geographic did a special, and I did read some of the truthers' information, and I read the commission report, it seems to me, and I may be wrong, but it seems to me that the jets were scrambled, but they went in the wrong direction. I think because they weren't quite sure, there was that component there, another piece of that. Why didn't they take them down? Headed down the Hudson, going past us. Why didn't they take them down? It seems to me that that's what they missed. And I also think they weren't quite aware at the time. They weren't paying attention. It seemed like you remember, if you're watching and if you're reading about it, with all the jets, they didn't even know who was still in the air and who was down. Remember, that was part of the discussion about Flight 93. Nobody even knew they were still up in the air, and they didn't know where they were headed. So there was so much uncertainty at that time. I think it was utter chaos. And I have a friend who was actually at 9/11 that day. He went down later on in that day, and he said to me that he was stationed at Ground Zero, and he said, if you want to see chaos, you should see what happened there, because nobody knew what the hell they were doing. They were all doing things differently, and everybody's going on different information. Nobody knew who was really in charge. It was utter chaos there. So I think there was a lot of that day and the next few days. I think nobody knew. Everybody, first of all, I think a lot of people were in shock. But then it was almost like, nobody knew who do I go to get the right information? And then what do we need to do from that? So I think that part of it, the jets, I think is like one of those pieces. Yeah, go ahead.
I read where the jets in the United States are not routinely armed either. In other words, they don't carry live ordnance around with them every time they fly.
You know what, I don't know that for certain. You mean the ones like sitting at Rome or Griffiths or some of those?
Most of them tend to be reserve unit stuff, and they're not routinely armed. This isn't like they're in a combat situation.
Yeah, I don't know that to be certain. I'd have to check that out. It seems to me that the ones at Fort Drum are. But maybe that's because they're ready to be deployed all the time, and maybe that's why I think that. Because I go through that way when I head north. I agree with you about Afghanistan. It's gone on way too long, 10 years. And have we really accomplished anything there? You know, I think what happened was we had that feeling that we did in Iraq because we actually got out of there. But and even talking to some of the military that went there, you know, and they felt that they accomplished something. You know, whether they helped with the schools or they helped with the road building or something, but they actually felt that they did something. I don't get that feeling from people that have gone to Afghanistan. You know, a lot of people now are like, well, this has gone on for 10 years. It's one of those things where we're doing the same thing over and over again. You know, we're in the Korengal Valley, it's the same thing as it was before. We're over here and we did the same thing we did over there. It's like a never-ending story. You know, we talk about getting out of there soon. And what happens when we leave? I think what's going to happen is that country is always going to be in civil war, as you said. You know, no matter what we do, I think that's just the way it's going to be. So,
even if the Taliban, more radical elements, were to take over, we should leave. And if they do take over, if the training camps were to reappear, we can incinerate them. And we can incinerate them very easily. But not with boots on the ground.
Well, all over the place, yeah. There was a documentary done which actually follows the military for a year over there. And for the life of me, I can't remember the name of it. It's worth watching because it doesn't have a political twist to it at all. It actually talks about being with the military and watching them. And so it shows you first of all, what we're doing over there, but it shows you the Afghan people and, you know, the conditions that they live in, which to us are, you know, horrendous because we all have nice houses and, you know, live in the lap of luxury compared to them. But it also shows how, you know, to the people over there, that, you know, they can be persuaded by the Taliban to do whatever it is you want them to do because this is a way of life for them. And so, you know, we're more like a hindrance. We come in and we're in the way. And, you know, we do certain things. We blow places up. You know, people get shot and killed. And then, you know, the Taliban comes in and, you know, kind of gives them what they want. And you know, then all of a sudden they hate us. So it gives you almost a thought like, gee, are we really wasting our time over there? And should we be doing something in Pakistan instead? You know, and because now as we're discovering, and they talked about it, and he talks about it in the book a little bit and some of the other material, where Pakistan seems to be the breeding ground. You know, why aren't we concentrating more over there? I mean, I know we have special forces there, and we're doing some intelligence there, but it seems to me that, you know, you have to, I think at some point you gotta, you know, kind of cut your losses and say, no matter how long we're here, the situation isn't going to change in Afghanistan. And so maybe let's look at another avenue. So, not that I think we should be at war every place in the world, but, you know, we need to figure this out. And I also think that terrorism, the terrorists that we have now, I don't think we're ever really going to defeat. You know, I think we have to be honest with that. I think that they're always going to come up with some new way to come after us, and, you know, they're always going to do something different because they view as what we have, first of all, as something that's probably not right, but it's also something that they want. I think it's that jealousy factor. So I honestly believe that that's going to be a never-ending battle. You know, I don't think we're going to get away from that. Yeah, I'm sure somebody could dispute that. Anything else? Anything else? Any questions about anything else?
If not, thanks for coming.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you for coming.